Lena Vargas stared at the crumpled bills folded in her palm and felt a hollowness that had nothing to do with the biting Wyoming wind sweeping across the parking lot. $500. That was all she had left, all that remained of 18 years of a life she had built with her bare hands, only to watch it get signed away in a courthouse on a Tuesday afternoon. What you are about to hear is the story of a woman who was handed nothing and turned it into everything. A woman who, with $500 and 2 children depending on her, walked into a government auction and bought the one thing nobody else wanted, a rotting, abandoned military bunker buried deep in the hills outside a small Wyoming town. Everyone laughed. The local paper ran a joke about it. Her ex-husband sent a smug text she never answered, but what Lena Vargas discovered when she finally pried open that rusted bunker door would silence every single one of them and unearth a secret that had been waiting underground for more than 70 years. Stay with me, because this is the story of how one desperate decision became the most powerful thing a mother ever did for her children. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Lena Vargas was 44 years old, and she had not cried in front of her children in 3 months. Not when the court finalized the divorce. Not when the movers came and took the furniture that was technically Derek's because his name was on every receipt. Not when Sophia, her 17-year-old daughter, quietly packed her room into 2 garbage bags without being asked, because Sophia had learned to read the rooms of crisis long before she should have had to. Not when Noah, her 14-year-old son, told her one night while they were sharing a gas station dinner that he didn't really need new cleats this season, that his old ones were fine, even though Lena had watched him wince every time he kicked a ball for the past 6 weeks. She had not cried in front of them, but sitting alone in the parking lot of the Crestfall Community Center on a gray November morning, with the wind coming down hard off the Bighorn foothills and that $500 folded in her hand like a last will and testament, Lena Vargas finally let herself feel the full weight of what had happened to her life. It had taken Derek less than 2 weeks to file the papers after he walked out. 18 years of marriage, 18 years of showing up, of building something together, of being the one who kept the household breathing while he grew his landscaping business into something real, and he had walked into a law office on a Monday and walked out with a plan to dismantle all of it by Friday. Lena had not seen it coming the way she should have. Maybe she had. Maybe the silences at dinner had been warnings she translated as exhaustion, and the weekends he spent at the office had been something other than work. She would never know for certain, and she had decided she no longer needed to. What she did know was this: Derek had prepared for the divorce long before she realized they were heading toward one. His attorney was a man named Gerald Fitch, who had represented half the business owners in Crestfall over the past 2 decades. The landscaping business, the trucks, the equipment, all of it was structured under a company that Lena had co-signed documents for without fully understanding what she was agreeing to. Her own attorney, a kind but overwhelmed woman from the county legal aid office, had done her best. It was not enough. After 9 months of proceedings that wore Lena down to something she barely recognized in the mirror, the settlement was finalized. She received $3,200 and joint custody of Sophia and Noah. Derek kept the house in the Millbrook subdivision, the business and the life they had assembled together. He also kept their shared social circle, most of whom seemed to choose sides the way people choose teams, based on proximity, not principle. Lena had used $2,400 of the settlement to rent a 2-bedroom apartment in the older part of Crestfall, the part of town people referred to as the Flats, where the streets hadn't been repaved since the 90s and every house seemed to need something. She spent the remaining $800 on groceries, school supplies, a second-hand lamp, and 2 sets of bed sheets. She applied for 18 jobs in the first 6 weeks, receptionist positions, retail openings, a part-time role at the library she had wanted badly, and received 4 responses, 2 of which were automated rejections. Now the 3-month lease on the apartment was expiring. Her landlord, a retired ranch hand named Clive, had been patient and not unkind. But his patience had a shape to it. A formal letter slid under her door the previous Thursday, letting her know that if she could not pay the next month's rent by the end of the week, he would need to begin the process of reclaiming the unit. He had apologized in the letter. He had meant it. That somehow made it worse. $500. That was what remained after buying the kids' winter coats, paying the gas bill, and covering Noah's antibiotics when the ear infection came on and she could not afford to let it go untreated. $500 for a woman with 2 children, no employment, and 4 days left on her apartment. She sat in that parking lot for a long time, watching the people of Crestfall move through their ordinary Tuesday. A woman loaded groceries into her car. 2 men stood outside the hardware store talking about nothing urgent. A school bus moved slowly down Center Street. Everything looked exactly the same as it always had, and nothing in the world seemed to know that Lena Vargas was sitting 30 feet away holding the last $500 between her children and the street. That was when she noticed the flyer. It had been stapled to the community board on the lamppost at the edge of the parking lot, half covered by a notice for a church bake sale. She almost didn't see it. She almost drove away. But something, call it desperation, call it instinct, call it the particular attention of someone who has run out of other options, made her stop and look. Crestfall County Government Surplus and Condemned Property Auction, Thursday 10 a.m. County Administration Building, all properties sold as is, no warranties, no exceptions. Lena sat with the flyer in her hands for a long, quiet moment. The wind pulled at the edges of the paper. Somewhere across the parking lot, a car door slammed. Then she folded the flyer carefully, placed it in her coat pocket, and started the car. Lena Vargas had not always been a woman sitting alone in a parking lot with $500 and nowhere to go. There had been a version of her, a younger, steadier version, who had walked through the world with direction and a quiet kind of confidence that people noticed without always being able to name. She had grown up in Laramie, the second of 3 daughters born to a Mexican-American mechanic named Hector and a schoolteacher named Diane, who graded papers at the kitchen table every night after dinner like it was a sacred ritual. They were not wealthy, but they were organized people, deliberate people, and they had raised Lena to believe that hard work and clear thinking were the 2 most reliable tools a person could carry through life. She had been good at school, not in a showy way, but in the way of someone who genuinely wanted to understand things. She studied accounting at the University of Wyoming, graduated on time, and landed a position with a mid-sized agricultural firm in Casper before she had even attended her own graduation ceremony. She was 23 years old. She had a salary, a studio apartment she had furnished herself piece by piece, and a 5-year plan she had written out in a green spiral notebook she kept on her nightstand. By every reasonable measure, Lena Vargas was exactly where she had intended to be. She met Derek at a colleague's barbecue the summer she turned 25. He was tall and easy with conversation, the kind of man who filled a room not by being loud but by being certain, certain of his opinions, certain of his plans, certain that everything was going to work out well because things generally had for him. He ran a small landscaping crew at the time, but he talked about it like it was the beginning of something much larger, and Lena, who respected ambition in a way that was almost instinctive, found herself drawn in before she had thought carefully enough about what she was being drawn toward. They dated for 14 months. They married in a small ceremony in Laramie with both families present. Lena was 27. She told herself she would keep working after the wedding, and she meant it fully when she said it. Sophia arrived 11 months later, earlier than planned, and with the particular force that first children tend to arrive, reorganizing everything around them without apology. Lena took a leave of absence from the accounting firm. The leave extended. Derek's business was growing faster than either of them had expected, and the logistics of 2 full-time careers and an infant in a town with limited childcare options made the math come out the same way every time. Someone had to be the one who stayed. Lena was the one who stayed. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself this for years, the way people tell themselves things that are easier to defer than to examine. Noah came 3 years after Sophia. The accounting firm filled her position permanently. Derek's business expanded into full landscape design and commercial contracts, and by the time their children were in elementary school, the Vargas family had moved to Crestfall, where Derek had landed a major contract with a resort development outside town, and Lena had become, without any single decision she could point to, the person who made everything else possible. She ran the house, managed the scheduling, handled the school communications, organized the finances she was never quite given full access to, drove to every practice and every appointment and every obligation that arose, and hosted the dinners Derek needed for his business relationships with the kind of effortless warmth that people complimented without recognizing as labor. She was, by the definitions most commonly applied to such things, an exceptional wife. She was also quietly and gradually disappearing. She did not see it clearly while it was happening. That is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said. It is difficult to perceive the slow narrowing of a life when you are busy living it, when there are lunches to pack and permission slips to sign, and a husband whose growing business seems to require more of your invisible support with each passing season. Lena had not noticed how thoroughly she had been absorbed into Derek's life until the day his attorney handed her a document that made clear in precise legal language just how little of that life had ever been structured to include her. The divorce did not break Lena Vargas, but it did something almost as damaging. It revealed, all at once, the full distance between who she had been and who she had become. The green spiral notebook with the 5-year plan was in a box in her parents' garage in Laramie. The accounting license had lapsed years ago and would require recertification. The career she had stepped away from temporarily had been temporarily gone for 16 years. She was 44 years old, starting from nothing, and the only audience for any of it was a 17-year-old girl, trying not to show her fear, and a 14-year-old boy, wearing shoes that were 2 sizes too small. Thursday morning arrived cold and flat, the kind of Wyoming November sky that offers no particular promise in any direction. Lena drove Sophia and Noah to school, said nothing about where she was going afterward, and made her way to the Crestfall County Administration building on her own. She had spent 2 days thinking about the auction flyer, turning it over in her mind the way you turn over a problem that has no clean solution, looking for angles, testing possibilities, trying to find a version of it that made enough sense to act on. She had not found one, but she was going anyway, because going was the only thing she had left. The auction room was a low-ceilinged space off the main corridor of the administration building, with folding chairs arranged in uneven rows and a podium at the front, where Phil Durbin, a heavy-set county official with a mustache and the practiced boredom of a man who had done this many times before, shuffled papers and waited for the room to fill. Lena counted approximately 25 people when she took her seat near the back. Most were men in fleece jackets or canvas coats, contractors and developers she recognized from the years she had spent attending Derek's business dinners. A few turned when she walked in. She saw the recognition move across their faces. Derek Vargas's ex-wife, the one who'd gotten the apartment in the flats, and she watched them look away with the particular discomfort of people deciding not to acknowledge something inconvenient. She sat down and kept her eyes on the front of the room. Durbin worked through the list efficiently. A vacant commercial lot on the north side of town sold for $11,000 to a contractor Lena vaguely recognized. A residential property with foundation issues went for $34,000. A decommissioned storage facility near the highway sold quickly to an investment group that had clearly come prepared. Each number landed like a door closing. Lena watched them go and did the math she already knew the answer to. She was about to stand up and leave, already reaching for her coat, already calculating how to explain to Sophia and Noah what came next, when Durbin cleared his throat and shuffled to the final page on his clipboard. "Last one for today," he said, in a tone that suggested even he found this one mildly absurd. Property located at the end of Holloway Ridge Road, approximately 4 miles outside Crestfall city limits. Former private bunker structure, concrete construction, built approximately 1951, decommissioned and abandoned since 1973. Sits on 3 acres of unincorporated county land. Condemned due to unknown interior condition, the county has not been able to access the interior for inspection. No utilities, no road improvements, no warranties of any kind. The county wants this off the books. We'll open bidding at $800. Silence. One of the contractors near the front said something under his breath that produced quiet laughter from the men around him. Nobody raised a hand. Durbin waited, pen hovering. "Fine," he said. $500. Anyone want 3 acres and a concrete structure for $500? More silence. Someone's phone buzzed. A chair scraped the floor as one of the developers stood up and started putting on his jacket. Lena's hand went up. The room did not go immediately silent so much as it seemed to lose its footing for a moment. Heads turned. Durbin looked at her over his clipboard with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite pity, somewhere in the middle where those two things blur. $500, he said. "Yes," Lena said. Her voice was steady. She was grateful for that. Durbin looked around the room. Anyone else? Nobody moved. He looked back at Lena. "All right then. Condemned bunker structure and 3 acres on Holloway Ridge Road, sold for $500. Please see Marge at the clerk's desk for paperwork." The laughter started before she had fully stood up. Not all of it was loud. Some of it was the restrained sideways kind that men produce when they want to be amused without being seen as cruel. but it was present and it was unanimous. She heard pieces of it as she walked toward the clerk's desk at the side of the room. She bought the hole in the ground, the bunker. Someone give her a hard hat. Derek was right about her. Marge Colton, the county clerk, was a trim woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the expression of someone who processed a great deal of other people's business without volunteering opinions about it. She handed Lena the paperwork without ceremony, walked her through each page quietly and efficiently, and when Lena signed the last sheet and passed it back across the desk, Marge held her gaze for just a moment. "The key's an old one," she said, sliding a single iron key across the counter, heavy, rusted at the bow. "We don't have a copy. Whatever's in there is yours now." Lena closed her hand around the key, picked up her copy of the deed, and walked back out through the lobby while someone behind her was already texting. By that evening, Derek's ex-wife bought a condemned hole in the ground for $500 had made the rounds through most of Crestfall. The road to Holloway Ridge was not so much a road as a suggestion. 2 tire tracks pressed into the earth at some point in the distant past, now half swallowed by dry grass and encroaching brush. Lena drove her aging Subaru as far as she could before the undergrowth made it impractical, then cut the engine and sat for a moment looking through the windshield at what she had spent her last $500 on. The bunker was not what she had pictured, though she was not sure what she had pictured exactly. It was a low concrete structure, longer than it was tall, set into the side of a hill like something the earth had partially digested and then thought better of. The concrete was stained dark in long vertical streaks from decades of rainwater. Rusted ventilation pipes rose from the roof at irregular intervals, several of them bent or missing entirely. A heavy steel door sat recessed into the front face of the structure, secured by a lock mechanism so corroded it looked almost geological. Juniper and scrub oak had grown up around the base of the walls on 3 sides. The whole thing had the particular stillness of a place that had not been disturbed in a very long time. Sophia stood beside the car with her arms crossed and said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. Noah walked a slow circle around the visible perimeter, pressing one hand against the concrete as if testing whether it was real. "It's solid," he said, turning back to his mother. "Like genuinely solid. They built this to last." That was the first useful thing anyone said about 12047 Holloway Ridge Road, and Lena held on to it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She spent the better part of an hour working the lock with the iron key and a can of lubricant she found in the back of the Subaru. The mechanism was so corroded that the key would not turn at all for the first 40 minutes. Lena worked at it methodically, applying the lubricant in stages, wiggling the key with patient pressure until something deep inside the lock released with a sound like a bone settling and the handle turned. The door required both of them, Lena and Noah bracing together against the steel edge while Sophia watched from a careful distance before it groaned open on hinges that screamed with decades of disuse. The air that came out was cold and dense and carried the specific quality of a sealed space, not the rot of decay but something drier and older than that. The smell of concrete and time and the particular stillness of a room that had been waiting. Lena shined her phone light inside. The bunker was a single main corridor approximately 40 feet long with 3 rooms branching off it, 2 on the left side and 1 larger one at the far end. The walls were bare concrete, smooth and intact. The floor was the same, no water damage, no collapsed sections. The sealed door and the hillside insulation had done exactly what they were designed to do. Everything was dry and structurally sound, in a way the house she'd lost in the divorce had never quite managed to be. They moved through it carefully. The first 2 side rooms were empty except for metal shelving units bolted to the walls, military grade, still perfectly anchored. The main room at the far end was larger, perhaps 20 feet square, with a ventilation system mounted near the ceiling and a heavy wooden table positioned in the center that someone had left behind when the place was decommissioned. On the shelves along the far wall sat rows of metal storage cases, sealed and stacked with a precision that suggested they had been arranged with intention rather than haste. Sophia counted them quietly. 14 cases. Noah tried to lift one of the lower ones and looked at his mother with an expression somewhere between surprise and alarm. "Mom," he said, "this one's heavy." Lena crossed the room to the table. On its surface, partially obscured by a thin layer of dust, sat a single item, a leather folio, the kind used for documents. Its cover cracked but intact, held shut by a corroded brass clasp. Embossed on the front, just visible through the grime, were two letters, A.H. Augustus Holloway. Lena set her phone on the table with the light facing upward and reached for the folio with hands that were not entirely steady. The clasp resisted for only a moment before it gave. The leather cover fell open. Inside were pages, dense, handwritten, covering both sides of each sheet in a small and careful script. At the top of the first page, underlined twice, were words that made the room feel suddenly smaller. To whoever finds this, what is sealed in this room does not belong to the government. It never did, and I have spent 30 years making certain they cannot have it back. Lena read for 3 hours without stopping. She sat on the concrete floor of the bunker's main room with her back against the wall and her phone propped against the edge of the table for light, turning each page of Augustus Holloway's folio with the careful attention of someone who understands they are handling something that will not survive carelessness. Sophia sat beside her, reading along in silence. Noah had positioned himself near the door, keeping watch on the darkening hillside outside with the quiet seriousness of a boy who had matured faster than any 14-year-old should have to. Augustus Jefferson Holloway had been born in Cheyenne in 1901, the son of a railroad surveyor and a woman who taught herself engineering from borrowed textbooks because the universities of her era would not admit her. He had inherited her aptitude and spent the first 2 decades of his adult life as a private geological engineer, contracting with mining companies and land developers across Wyoming and Montana to survey subsurface formations and assess extraction potential. He was, by every account he gave of himself in the folio, exceptionally good at what he did. He was also, by his own frank admission, a man who had made the mistake of being too good at it in the wrong company. In 1947, Holloway had been contracted by a private energy consortium operating out of Denver, a group of investors with government connections who were in the early stages of what would become a significant natural gas extraction operation across the Wyoming basin. His assignment had been to survey a 20-mile corridor of land running through Crestfall County and produce a geological assessment of its subsurface mineral potential. He had done this thoroughly and correctly, and what he found had astonished him. Beneath the surface of the land running from the Bighorn foothills through the eastern edge of what was then unincorporated Crestfall County lay one of the most significant natural gas formations he had encountered in 30 years of survey work. He documented everything: the formation depth, the estimated reserves, the geological mapping of the entire corridor, and filed his findings with both the consortium and, critically, with the Wyoming State Geological Survey in Cheyenne under his own name, as was his professional right under the terms of his contract. What happened next was the kind of thing that happened with some regularity to people who discovered valuable things in the presence of more powerful people. The consortium moved quickly to file extraction claims on the land using Holloway's survey data, while simultaneously producing a revised version of their contract with him that stripped his name from the findings and reclassified his work as proprietary property of the consortium itself. They had lawyers and relationships with county officials. Holloway had neither, at least not locally. He fought it for 4 years through state channels. He lost at every level, in courts where the judges knew the consortium's principals by their first names. By 1951, he had exhausted his legal options and nearly all of his savings, but he had not surrendered his records. He built the bunker himself that year, with help from 2 men he trusted completely, and sealed inside it everything he had: the original survey documentation filed under his name with the state, the unaltered version of his contract, correspondence between consortium members discussing how to manage his objections, and the 14 sealed cases that contained his original survey equipment, geological core samples, and the precise technical data that proved his findings were his. He wrote the folio as both a record and an instruction, addressed to whoever found it, laying out in clear and methodical language exactly what each case contained and exactly what it proved. But the most significant document in the folio was not about the past, it was about the present. Holloway, anticipating that his legal battle would outlast him, had filed a mineral rights claim through the state of Wyoming, not through Crestfall County, where the corruption was concentrated, but directly through the state office in Cheyenne, establishing that the natural gas formation he had discovered and documented was subject to his prior claim under Wyoming extraction law. He had attached this filing to the deed of the 3-acre property on Holloway Ridge Road, creating a legal instrument that tied the mineral rights claim permanently to whoever held title to the land. Lena read that section 3 times. She pulled up Wyoming property law on her phone with trembling hands and cross-referenced what she was reading against what Holloway had written. The language was precise and deliberate, The mineral rights were attached to the land title. The land title now belonged to Lena Vargas. Sophia looked at her mother in the low light of the bunker. "Mom," she said carefully, "what's under Crestfall right now?" Lena set the folio down on the concrete floor and pressed both hands flat against her knees to stop them from shaking. "A natural gas formation," she said quietly, "one of the most significant in this part of Wyoming. And according to everything in this room, it has belonged to Augustus Holloway's estate for 70 years. She paused. "And now it belongs to us." Lena spent the next 4 days in the Crestfall Public Library. She arrived when it opened and stayed until the librarian turned the lights off, with Sophia and Noah rotating in and out after school to bring her food and take turns sitting beside her while she worked through every document in Holloway's folio against every piece of Wyoming mineral rights law she could locate. She made photocopies of everything, stored copies in 3 separate locations, and photographed every page of the folio on her phone, with the methodical focus of someone who understood that what she was holding could be made to disappear if the wrong people found out about it too soon. On the 5th day, she called Franklin Drake. She had found his name through the Wyoming State Bar Directory, searching specifically for attorneys with experience in mineral rights litigation who did not have existing relationships with Crestfall's business community. Drake ran a solo practice out of Sheridan, 2 hours north, handling energy law, property disputes, and the kind of complicated subsurface rights cases that most small-town attorneys avoided out of practical self-preservation. His assistant told Lena he was busy. Lena said she understood and asked her to tell him that she had original documentation of a mineral rights claim predating every extraction agreement currently operating in Crestfall County. The assistant put her on hold for 45 seconds and came back to offer her an appointment the following morning. Franklin Drake was a spare, precise man in his late 50s who wore reading glasses on the end of his nose and had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent decades in rooms where a great deal of money was at stake. He spread Holloway's documents across his conference table and examined each one without speaking for nearly 2 hours, while Lena sat across from him and waited. When he finally looked up, his expression was controlled in the way of someone making a deliberate effort to remain professional in the presence of something extraordinary. "This filing with the state," he said, tapping the mineral rights document with one finger. "This is real. It was properly executed and it is on record in Cheyenne. I've already confirmed it while you were sitting there." He paused. "Do you understand what the formation Holloway documented runs beneath?" "Most of downtown Crestfall," Lena said. "The commercial district, the resort development on the eastern edge of town, and, if his survey maps are accurate, a significant portion of the extraction corridor currently being operated by Meridian Energy under leases granted by the county." Drake removed his glasses and set them on the table. Meridian Energy was the largest natural gas operation in the county, a subsidiary of a national energy company with revenues that dwarfed the entire municipal budget of Crestfall several times over. "If this holds up," Drake said slowly, "every extraction lease Meridian is operating in that corridor is built on a mineral rights claim that was never legally theirs to grant. The county leased them rights to something the county did not own." "When do we file?" Lena asked. Drake looked at her steadily. "I need 2 weeks to prepare this properly, and I need you to understand something before we proceed. What you're about to do is going to make you very unpopular with very powerful people very quickly. Meridian has a legal team that could fill this building. The county will fight this. Every business operating on that land will fight this. This is not going to be a quiet process." "I've been unpopular with powerful people before," Lena said. "I survived that too." Drake allowed himself a small, careful smile. 2 weeks, he said. "Then we file." The filing hit the public record on a Wednesday and detonated through Crestfall like something structural giving way. By Thursday morning, the story had been picked up by the Wyoming Tribune, and by Friday it had reached national energy industry publications. Single mother's $500 bunker purchase may invalidate decades of natural gas extraction agreements. The headlines had the slightly disbelieving quality of stories that seem too improbable to be true and turn out to be true anyway. Conrad Hawthorne appeared at Lena's apartment door on Saturday morning. He was the largest private landowner in Crestfall's commercial district, a man who had built his real estate portfolio over 30 years with the particular confidence of someone who had never seriously been challenged. He wore an expensive coat and an expression that was working hard to stay pleasant. He offered her $400,000 to drop the claim and go away quietly. He framed it as generosity. He implied, without saying directly, that the alternative would be lengthy and painful and that she should consider her children, Lena stood in her doorway in the cold morning air and looked at him with the calm of someone who had already been through the worst version of this kind of conversation. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said, "Franklin Drake tells me the extraction royalties alone from Holloway's formation, calculated at current market rates, represent a claim worth somewhere between $40 and $80 million. She paused. "So I'm going to need you to go back to whoever sent you and tell them we're not interested in $400,000. She closed the door before he could respond. The 30 days following Franklin Drake's filing were the strangest of Lena's life. She was still living in the Flats apartment, still shopping at the discount grocery store on Meridian Avenue, still driving the aging Subaru with the cracked rear bumper and the heater that worked on 3 of its 4 settings. Nothing about her daily circumstances had changed in any material way, and yet the world around her had shifted in the particular manner of things that have been set irrevocably in motion, quietly at first, and then all at once. Reporters called. She declined most of them, speaking only to a journalist from a women's magazine in Denver who had covered mineral rights disputes before and understood the legal landscape well enough to report it accurately. The story that ran described Lena simply and honestly, the divorce, the settlement, the auction, the bunker, the folio, the formation, and let the facts carry the weight without embellishment, because the facts were already remarkable enough. The piece was shared widely. Letters began arriving at Franklin Drake's office from people across Wyoming and beyond who had been following the case, many of them women in circumstances not entirely unlike Lena's own. Derek called twice. She let both calls go to voicemail and did not listen to the messages for several days. When she finally did, the first was confused and the second was conciliatory in the strained way of someone who has recently consulted an attorney and been advised to be careful. She deleted both and did not respond. Conrad Hawthorne's consortium, a hastily assembled coalition of Crest Falls major property owners, the county government, and Meridian Energy's legal representatives, filed a motion to dismiss Drake's claim on 3 separate grounds. Drake filed responses to all 3 within a week, each one thorough enough that the judge, a state district court appointee named Rosalind Vance, who had no existing relationship with Crest Falls business community, declined to dismiss and scheduled a formal hearing. The hearing lasted 2 days. Drake presented Holloway's original state filing, the unaltered survey documentation, the chain of title from Holloway to the 3-acre property, and the deed transfer to Lena. He called a geological expert from the University of Wyoming who confirmed, using independent modern survey data, that Holloway's 1947 assessment of the formation was accurate and that the subsurface mineral rights in question were demonstrably tied to the original claim. The consortium's legal team presented their counter-arguments with considerable force and considerable expense. Judge Vance took the matter under advisement and asked both parties to consider whether a negotiated resolution might be preferable to a protracted trial. It was the kind of judicial suggestion that both sides understood as something closer to a directive. The consortium came back within 2 weeks. Their opening offer was $3 million. Drake declined without consulting Lena because they had already discussed the floor. The consortium came back at $7 million. Drake declined again. There was a pause of 4 days during which Lena slept badly and said very little to anyone, and then the consortium's lead attorney called Drake on a Thursday afternoon and presented a final offer. $12 million, a full release of all claims against the mineral rights formation by all parties, and a separate agreement in which Meridian Energy would pay an ongoing annual royalty to Lena's estate for continued extraction operations at a rate negotiated independently of the settlement figure. The royalty figure, Drake told her quietly when he called, would amount to approximately $300,000 per year at current extraction volumes. Lena sat on the edge of her bed in the Flats apartment with the phone against her ear and listened to Franklin Drake read the terms in his precise, careful voice. "Counter," she said when he finished. $14 million, same royalty structure, and I keep the 3-acre property and the bunker. Everything inside it stays with me. Drake was quiet for a moment. "The bunker has no material value to them," he said. "They'll agree to that." "It has value to me," Lena said. Drake relayed the counter. The consortium responded within an hour. Agreed. The settlement was signed 11 days later in Drake's Sheridan office. The wire transfer arrived the following morning. Lena sat at the small kitchen table in the Flats apartment with her laptop open and watched the number appear in her account with the slightly unreal quality of something seen in a dream you are aware you are having. She did not move for several minutes. Then Sophia came into the kitchen in her school uniform, poured herself a glass of water, and looked at her mother's expression with the careful attention she had developed over the past year for reading situations before they were explained to her. "Mum," she said quietly, "did something happen?" Lena closed the laptop and looked at her daughter, this composed, brave, 17-year-old girl who had packed her room into garbage bags without being asked and never once asked for anything in return. "Yes," Lena said. She reached across the table and took Sophia's hand. "Something happened. Go wake up your brother. I need to tell you both something," she told them at that kitchen table in the apartment in the flats, while the Wyoming morning came pale and cold through the window. Noah sat very still through most of it, then put his face in his hands and breathed slowly for a while. Sophia held her mother's hand and did not let go until the end. "We're going to be okay," Lena said. "I need you to really hear that. We are going to be okay." Lena Vargas did not move to a bigger house right away. This surprised people, and she understood why. The narrative logic of the thing seemed to demand it. The woman who had lived in the flats apartment with 2 children and a cracked rear bumper on her Subaru should, upon receiving $14 million and an annual royalty, immediately relocate to something that looked like the life she had lost. A house in the Millbrook subdivision, perhaps. Something with a proper driveway and new appliances and enough square footage to make the previous 2 years feel like a story that had happened to someone else. But Lena had spent 18 years living inside someone else's version of what her life should look like, and she had learned, at considerable cost, to be careful about that particular impulse. So she stayed in the flats apartment through the winter, paid Clive 3 months' rent in advance, and spent the first 60 days after the settlement doing almost nothing except thinking clearly for the first time in years. The first decision she made was about Franklin Drake. She paid his contingency fee in full, then wrote him a separate check that was not contractually required, and that made him sit quietly in his office chair for a long moment before he said anything. He had believed in a case that no one else would have touched, and that had a value that existed outside the terms of their agreement. The second decision was about the bunker. She hired a structural engineer from Casper to assess the property on Holloway Ridge Road and confirm what Noah had said on the first day, that it was solid, that it had been built to last, that the concrete was as sound as the day Augustus Holloway had poured it. Then she hired a small, careful renovation crew who understood that their job was not to modernize the structure but to preserve it. They cleaned the interior, stabilized the ventilation system, installed proper lighting and a reliable heating unit, and restored the steel door to full working order. They left the concrete walls bare and the wooden table in the center of the main room exactly where Holloway had left it. They left the metal shelving intact. They built a proper road from the highway to the property, lined with young juniper trees that would take years to grow properly and would be beautiful when they did. When the renovation was complete, Lena established the Holloway Foundation, headquartered in the bunker on the 3-acre property that was now officially and permanently hers. The foundation's purpose was specific and practical: emergency financial assistance, legal aid, and job retraining for women in Crestfall County who were rebuilding after divorce or financial crisis. It offered the things Lena had needed and had not been able to find: a real attorney when the public defender wasn't enough, a bridge payment when the gap between losing everything and earning something new was too wide to cross alone, and a pathway back into the workforce for women whose resumes looked, as Lena's had, like ancient history. In the first year, the Holloway Foundation helped 31 women. By the end of the second year, the number had grown to 86. Applications came in from across Wyoming. Lena hired a small staff, brought in Drake as a legal advisor, and partnered with the University of Wyoming on a professional re-entry program that offered accelerated certification courses at no cost to foundation recipients. She eventually bought a house, not in Millbrook. She bought a modest place on the western edge of Crestfall with a wide porch and enough land for a kitchen garden, close enough to the community she had decided to stay part of, far enough from the version of that community that had laughed at her in the county administration building on a November Thursday. Sophia went to law school at the University of Colorado. She called her mother every Sunday without fail and talked about the cases that moved her, the ones involving women who had been outmaneuvered by better-funded legal teams, the ones where the outcome had turned on something as simple as knowing what to file and where. Noah studied structural engineering. On the day he was accepted into his program, he told Lena that the first thing he had ever wanted to build properly was the road to the bunker, and that he planned to build things that lasted the way Holloway had built things that lasted. Lena kept the iron key on a hook by her front door. She kept Augustus Holloway's folio in a climate-controlled case in the main room of the bunker. visible to everyone who visited the foundation. Beside it, framed simply in dark wood, was a single sentence she had taken from the last page of his journal, the final thing he had written before he sealed the door and walked away into an outcome he would never see. I do not know who you are, but I know you were not supposed to find this, and I know that means you needed it. Lena had read those words the night everything changed, sitting on a concrete floor with her children beside her and nothing left to lose. She had read them many times since. They meant something different each time, something quieter, something more certain, something that had less to do with money and land and legal filings and more to do with the particular truth that some things survive exactly because they were built by someone who refused to accept that justice had an expiration date. She was 44 years old when she walked into that auction room with $500 and no plan. She was 46 when the Holloway Foundation helped its 100th woman rebuild something that someone else had tried to take permanently apart. Not one day of that felt like luck. Every day of it felt like a choice she had made in a parking lot on a cold November morning when she had no reason to believe it would lead anywhere good, and she had made it anyway. In the 3 years that followed the settlement, Lena was asked many times to explain the decision. Reporters asked it. The journalist from Denver asked it during a follow-up interview. Women who came to the Holloway Foundation asked it while sitting across from her in the main room of the bunker, in the same space where Augustus Holloway had once sat and written his last defiant pages by lamplight. They all wanted to know the same thing in slightly different words. How did you know? What made you raise your hand? What made you spend your last $500 on something everyone said was worthless? And Lena always gave them the same honest answer, because it was the only one she had. She hadn't known. There was no wisdom in it, no foresight, no quiet certainty that she was making the right move. There had been nothing in that auction room except a woman who had run out of other options and a property nobody else wanted, and 4 days before she lost the only roof her children had. She had raised her hand because she had nothing left to protect by keeping it down. That was the full extent of it. But here is what she came to understand in the years after, and this is the part that matters, the part she made sure to say clearly to every woman who sat across from her in that concrete room and looked at her with the particular expression of someone trying to find the formula, the secret, the thing that would make their own desperate situation resolve the way Lena's had. The decision itself was not the miracle. The miracle was that she had not talked herself out of it. Because there had been a version of that morning where she drove past the community board and did not stop. There had been a version where she sat in the auction room and watched the numbers go too high and left before the final property was called. There had been a version where she heard the laughter and let it settle over her like a verdict. There had been a version where she looked at that rusted bunker door and concluded that the people mocking her were right, that she was desperate and deluded, and that the sensible thing was to accept defeat gracefully and figure out something more realistic. All of those versions of that day existed. She had felt every one of them pulling at her while it was happening. The voice that said you are being ridiculous was not quiet. The voice that catalogued everything she stood to lose by humiliating herself further was not vague. The voice that reminded her of the laughter in the auction room, of Derek's smug text, of every person in Crestfall who had watched her fall apart and found it clarifying. That voice was loud and specific, and it knew exactly which parts of her were still soft enough to reach. She raised her hand anyway, not because she was brave in any exceptional way, not because she had a plan or a vision or any particular reason to believe it would work, but because the alternative, the quiet, reasonable, dignity-preserving alternative of doing nothing, had a cost she had finally calculated clearly enough to reject it. Doing nothing cost her children everything. Raising her hand cost her $500 and the goodwill of people whose goodwill had never actually protected her from anything. When she laid it out in those terms, in that parking lot, in that auction room, on that cold hillside, looking at a bunker that smelled like sealed time, the math was not complicated. The Holloway Foundation's second-year report included a section Lena had written herself, titled simply, On Beginning. It was 3 paragraphs long, and it said, among other things, this: that beginning is almost never the inspiring moment it appears to be in retrospect, that in real time, beginning looks like uncertainty and feels like fear and sounds like the laughter of people who have already decided you are going to fail, that the most important thing beginning requires is not courage in the cinematic sense, but rather a specific and deliberate refusal, the refusal to let other people's certainty about your limitations become your own. Augustus Holloway had understood that. He had sealed his truth in concrete and waited 70 years rather than let the people who had stolen from him have the final word. He had built something designed to outlast them, and it had. He had trusted that the truth he buried would eventually surface in the hands of someone who needed it and would know what to do with it. Lena thought about him often. She thought about the night he must have spent closing that bunker door for the last time, knowing he would not live to see what happened next, trusting the structure he had built and the legal instruments he had filed, and the long, slow patience of justice that moves on its own timeline and does not consult the people waiting for it. She thought about what it must have taken to do all of that, to do it carefully and completely and without any guarantee, and she found in it something that felt, more than anything else, like kinship. She had her own version of that sealed door, her own version of the $500 and the laughter and the choice made in the absence of any reasonable expectation of success, and she had her own version of what came after. Not the money, not the settlement, not the headlines or the foundation or the new road lined with young junipers growing slowly towards something beautiful. Those things were real, and she was grateful for every one of them. But the thing she returned to, the thing she kept on the hook by her front door along with the iron key, was simpler than any of it. She had raised her hand when the room was laughing. She had opened the door. Everything that followed had been inside it, waiting. If you have ever sat with something small in your hands and wondered whether it was enough to begin with, Lena Vargas's answer is yes. It is always enough to begin with. The only thing that was never enough was giving up. If this story touched you in any way, if you have ever been dismissed, underestimated, or laughed at for a choice that others could not yet understand, leave one word in the comments that describes what you would do if you were standing in that auction room with your last $500 and nothing left to lose. Because the answers matter, because the community of people who refuse to give up is larger than any of us realize when we are sitting alone in a parking lot wondering if we are the only one. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Not because it promises that every desperate decision leads to $14 million and a foundation and a road lined with junipers. It does not make that promise, and neither does life. But because it is true. Because it happened. Because a woman with $500 and 2 children and 4 days left on her apartment raised her hand in a room full of people laughing at her, and the thing nobody wanted turned out to be the thing that changed everything. Dreams do not age, hope does not expire, and justice, even sealed in concrete for 70 years, eventually finds its way into the hands of someone willing to open the door. Welcome to our family of resilient souls. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.